Oh, juggler. It's good to see you all.
Thank you for joining us. I'll just kind of start before we start by saying it's super fun to have a great conversation with a group full of friends. Thank you for joining us. I'll just kind of start before we start by saying it's super fun to have a great. Sorry about that, but that's really awesome. Thank you guys. It's a whole new level of awesomeness. Okay, I'm going to press apply and we're going to be going live. So give me 1 second. All right. Hello and welcome to HETP's Connected Communities virtual briefing series. This digital forum is dedicated to exploring the intersections of ethics, technology, and public policy by engaging scholars, community thought leaders, and policymakers from diverse backgrounds to give a greater context to the lived reality of Black and Brown communities in our increasingly digital world. My name is Alejandro, and I'm the Executive Director for Hispanic Technology and Telecommunications Partnership. HETP is a CEO roundtable of 16 of the country's oldest and largest Latino civil rights organizations who work in coalition to promote access, adoption, and the full utilization of technology and telecommunications resources by the Latino community in the United States. Through our community engagement, congressional education, and by serving as a national voice for Latinos in tech and telecom policy, HETP member organizations work to support the social, political, and economic advancement of over 50 million Americans of Latino descent by facilitating access to high-quality education, economic opportunity, and effective healthcare through the use of technology tools and resources. Now, before we begin today's conversation, I want to invite our friends who are tuning in live through our website to join the conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag #DigitalPrivacyNow. That's hashtag #DigitalPrivacyNow. We will be checking in on Twitter throughout our dialogue today and have set aside some time towards the end of the conversation so that our panelists can answer some of your questions. So our conversation today centers the experience of vulnerable communities as our country attempts to confront the deeply embedded roots of systemic racism as we mourn the life of George Floyd, whose death was broadcast live around the world, leading to millions of Americans taking to the streets in protest against police brutality and state-sanctioned targeted acts of violence. The right to join with fellow citizens in protest or peaceful assembly in public forums is critical to a functioning democracy and at the core of our constitutionally protected rights under the First Amendment. From the Civil Rights Movement, to Stonewall, to the Women's March, and now to the global protest against police brutality, public protests have catalyzed transformational cultural and political change in the United States and continues to be an effective and powerful way of petitioning the government for redress of grievances. Unfortunately, law enforcement officials sometimes violate this right through various means, which tend to have a chilling effect on free public expression. Most recently, through the deployment of sophisticated surveillance tools that include wireless interception, license plate scanners, and facial recognition, which encroaches on a citizen's ability to protest anonymously. As law enforcement agencies continue to compile and request protest footage and images and are casting a wider surveillance net, our panel of civil rights advocates are raising concerns about digital privacy and advocating for the establishment of a federal standard to protect a person's right against warrantless and unreasonable searches, seizures, and the constant eye of the emerging surveillance state. Today's conversation is presented in partnership with the National Action Network. NAN is one of the leading civil rights organizations in the nation, with chapters throughout the United States. First founded in 1991 by Reverend Al Sharpton, NAN works within the spirit and tradition of Martin Luther King Jr. to promote a modern civil rights agenda that includes the fight for one standard of justice, decency, and equal opportunities for people. We are happy today to be joined by NAN's DC Bureau Chief, Ebony Riley, as well as Manaj Rami from CDT, Carlos Gutierrez from LGBT Tech, David John from the National Black Justice League, and KJ Bochy from New America's Open Institute. So with that, it is my pleasure to turn the mic over to Ebony Riley. Ebony, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Alejandro and HTTP for this opportunity to partner and join this awesome panel of experts. Protest to the murders of George Floyd, in the response to the murders of George Floyd. Breonna Taylor, and now Rayshard Brooks, and many others are not just expressions of outrage at their deaths or the long history of police using excessive force against Black communities. They are also a people's rejection of the state's violence and infringement on their rights, liberties, and autonomy of its citizens. Black and brown people feel over-policed and underprotected, and we're seeing the power of resistance, which has shifted the climate in this country. We should thank everyone who's come out to protest and to put their bodies on the line for what's right. I also challenge everyone to continue these conversations, but also act, to do so at home, at work, and in public spaces. My organization, National Action Network, as Alejandro has mentioned, that has over 120 chapters nationwide. We follow in the spirit and tradition of Dr. King to move demonstration to legislation. We've also been faced with a double pandemic. COVID has taken the lives of thousands of Black and brown people and again exposed the systemic racism that has terrorized our progress. A quick overview of a few things we've done during this time to respond has been, at NAN, we've distributed over 500,000 meals in 6 cities, 7 days a week, adding census materials, voter education information, and PPE to each care package. We're leveraging our Religious Affairs Department, who is doing mobile testing in South Carolina to provide COVID tests to the vulnerable. We're also continuing to support impacted families of police use of force and advocating for policy changes on a state and federal level. Lastly, Reverend Sharpton has announced that there will be a march on Washington led by these families Friday, August 28th. And to RSVP or for more information, please go to our website, which I can place in the chat, which is nationalactionnetwork.net. Now, I would like to introduce my brother in the movement, David Johns. David Johns serves as the executive director of the National Black Justice Coalition, a civil rights organization dedicated to the empowerment of Black, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people, including people living with HIV and AIDS. NBJC's mission is to end racism, homophobia, and LGBTQ bias and stigma. In 2013, Johns was appointed as the first executive director of the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans by President Obama, and served until the last day of the administration in 2017. Prior to his appointment, David has worked on the Hill on policy and so much more. He's recognized as a thought leader and a social justice champion. With his career, he is focused on improving life outcomes and opportunities for Black people. So David, now I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ebony, for that. I'm thankful to you and Alejandro for setting this table and for allowing me to have a seat at it. And to all of my colleagues, it's an honor to be with you in the arena doing this work. I want to ground today's conversation in 3 important facts. And again, I want to make way for the experts to then be able to address the specific concerns around privacy, data, and protections. And they are as follows. 1, all of the conversations that we should be having connected to the movement, not just to this moment, but to the movement, should be as radically inclusive as possible. There are so many people that are saying the name of George Floyd, and they should. There are fewer people who are saying the names of Breonna Taylor, and we should. There are some people saying the name of Ahmaud Arbery, and we should. Fewer people are saying the names of individuals who have intersectional identities, people who are Black and queer. For example, there are very few people who know the name of Tony McDade, the Black trans man murdered by the police in Tallahassee, Florida, less than 18 hours after having been the victim of a hate crime that was also recorded, and shared on Facebook. Last week, we lost 2 Black women, Dominique and Rhea Fales, right, in Pennsylvania and in Ohio. Right before that, there was Ayanna Dior, a Black trans woman who was beaten again on camera by grown boys. I say boys because men don't hit, let alone jump women, cis or trans. And I acknowledge this. I could go on and on. Our sister Arlene Polanco was left to die in isolation at a New Jersey prison industrial complex and institution. There are countless examples of people that have intersectional identities that are often erased when we have conversations about social justice, and when we forget to acknowledge the connections that have allowed for us to stand in this moment in the movement today. And so I want us to say all of their names and to be radically inclusive as we not only address existing problems, but we dream about possible solutions. The second is that all of these moments and this movement is anchored in anti-violence. So much of it is anti-violence that has been perpetuated by the police, but also other state-sanctioned actors, right? And so we should be clear that while we're having conversations about the ways in which police departments and other state-sanctioned agents are using data, that this is a conversation really about responding to violence. Violence that shows up in the language that is used and that is weaponized, in particular as we think about the way that Black Lives Matter activists are being terrorized right now, or the way that there are policies and practices that are adopted by companies or not adopted by companies that also serve to contribute to the violence that we're all responding to in this moment. And then the last is this. Anyone who knows me, my friends in this space, know that I care deeply about our babies. There are so many young people who are risking their lives literally to protest, to exercise their constitutional right to demand change. And we owe it to them at a minimum to protect their privacy. To ensure that as they are engaging in peaceful protests, that they are literally risking their lives when we think about COVID and the other global pandemics that we're facing, to ensure that their lives are not ruined by people who might otherwise use this technology in inappropriate and nefarious ways. And so there are a number of policies that exist. I celebrate having done some reading this morning of Google's AI policy priorities. There are guides that can allow us to think about continuing this conversation as the technology evolves, as it invariably will. But all of this should be anchored in acknowledging that there's so many babies who are watching, who are going to be dealing with the problems that we've created or we fail to address. And if we don't get this right for anybody, we should get it right for them. So lots more that we are interested in. But again, I hope that those grounding principles will help to anchor the conversation that we'll have today.
Thank you, David. And really, I just want to say thank you for helping us understand the urgency and the weight of this moment. You know, like David mentioned, American protests have sparked some of the most significant and consequential civil rights movements, not just here in the US, but around the world, including what the press reported as the Stonewall Riots, when LGBT people and specifically queer people of color took a stand against police brutality and intimidation. And I think that really is a great segue to Carlos. I'd love to kind of invite Carlos Gutierrez, who's the Deputy Director and General Counsel for LGBT Tech, where he works to empower LGBT communities and individuals by ensuring that media, telecommunications, and technology issues of specific concern to LGBT communities are addressed in public policy conversations. Carlos is an attorney with a deep understanding of technology and telecommunications, and actually worked in a support capacity drafting and implementing the Telecommunications Act of 1996, the Common Carrier Bureau. Carlos, as someone that knows or that works specifically with and for the LGBTQIA community, do you mind sharing with us some of the unique vulnerabilities and I think benefits experienced by queer communities online?
Right, sure. Thank you guys for putting this forum together. It's a really important conversation, and I'm very happy to be included. Yeah, I think as you alluded to and kind of mentioned a little bit, Alejandro, the modern LGBT movement was in many ways born out of social protest. The Stonewall Uprising or the Stonewall Rebellion was something that happened in 1969, where the police raided an LGBT bar that happened to cater to lower income, homeless youth, transgender individuals, and other people who did not have access. And they raided the bar, and that night, the people of color and the disadvantaged people that were there fought back, and the community fought back. And this turned into multiple nights of protest and social change that really led to the birth of the movement. This also comes out of the 1950s with the Lavender Scare, where the federal government started flushing out LGBT people from any job they had because they saw them as communist sympathizers. And ironically, because they were more likely to be blackmailed. And the only reason they were more likely to be blackmailed is because they were being, shunned and ostracized in the government, which led to the higher risk of blackmail. So the Lavender Scare and the Stonewall Riots are kind of basis for us. And Pride, every year that we celebrate, this is very, timely, is kind of a remembrance of the Stonewall Uprising in New York. And all of the work that we do and all of the Pride celebrations around the country are in celebration of this social movement. So it is very kind of timely and very kind of, relevant to what's kind of now. Also relevant is kind of the dangers that we have. We know from experience in history that profiling by law enforcement agency has had a disproportionate impact on the LGBTQ community. There's been surveys that of transgender people that find that 22% of the respondents who have interacted with the police experience bias-based harassment, which is much higher than any other group. And also transgender women of color are often profiled by police as engaging in sex work, simply for being outside and going about their daily routines. So the LGBTQ community, especially with the people of color and other minority communities, has not been a great experience. So surveillance tools in the hands of law enforcement are something that is very worrisome to our community. And just to use an example, face recognition used at protest that scan faces create a danger for them, and also create, even without anything else, it creates a chilling effect. Yesterday we had the amazing news out of the Supreme Court that, that Title VII covers employment and non-discrimination, which, all of a sudden allows LGBT people to work without being worried about being fired for the sexual orientation or gender identity. However, there's still housing discrimination, there's still social discrimination. And if there's a risk or a chance that a police surveillance tool like facial recognition will be used to identify someone who's not out in their community, or he may not be out to their employers or to their family, there's a chilling effect in allowing peaceful protests that is legal. And it's something that we're really looking at. There's a quote from ACLU that says, facial recognition is dangerous when it works and it's dangerous when it doesn't work. So, the first issue with facial recognition is that it is very inaccurate at this point, especially for communities of color. An MIT study that tested 3 commercial gender recognition systems found that they had error rates of up to 34% for dark-skinned women, which is 49 times what they have for white men. And this, of course, comes to how are these systems trained? And the fact that they're overwhelmingly being trained with white faces means that communities of color are going to have issues, and they're going to have result in erroneous identification. So that's a big problem with these systems. But even if we get to a place where the systems are more accurate, this is still going to be a huge issue in terms of privacy for communities. We are definitely involved in calling for a general federal law to control how facial recognition can be used by governments. We have instances where people whose law enforcement is having access to states' driver licenses databases for facial recognition purposes. And this is not a use that was expected. When you go get your license, you don't expect that photo is going to be used now in a law enforcement database to track you. So a federal legislation is something that we are definitely advocating for, something that the LGBTQ community would definitely need. And just in general, even if it's accurate, the potential for facial recognition to be used as a tool of repression abroad for LGBTQ communities is chilling. There are many countries where being LGBTQ is still punishable by death, imprisonment. So the use of this technology is not a matter of, of just convenience, it's a matter of life and death. And as they proliferate, we're going to run into more instances where they're being used by, regimes that may use them to suppress their populations. So the over-policing of minority communities, the impact on Black, trans, and other people of color for the LGBT community is something that we are definitely looking at, and something that we are worried about as we go forward with these digital surveillance tools.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you for that. I'm really interested in hearing more about that, especially from our audience as we move towards Q&A a little bit later. So I'm going to pivot to Mana. Mana, you work to understand and interrogate the deployment, use, and utility of surveillance tools by state actors, and more importantly, the impact on non-consenting vulnerable populations. I welcome the opportunity to hear your perspective and to share some of your work with CDT and the types of surveillance tools that you are seeing deployed, not just on protesters, but on also on refugees at our southern border. But first, I'm going to give you your introduction. Mana Asramahi serves as policy counsel with CDT's Freedom, Security, and Technology Project, Mana has worked with the International Human Rights Clinic. She's done immigration policy and litigation with the Harvard Immigration and Refugee Clinic Program and Crimmigration Clinic. Mana, thank you so much for taking time to join us today.
And make sure I'm unmuted. Thank you so much, Alejandro and Ebony, for putting this event together. It's really a timely panel for including me, and thank you for the other speakers for your really sage remarks. As mentioned, I'm Ana Azermi, and I work at the Center for Democracy and Technology. We're a DC-based nonprofit that advocates for digital human rights, civil rights, and civil liberties. And as mentioned, I work on our government surveillance team. As has been discussed, around the country for the last 3 weeks since the police murdered George Floyd, and in response to numerous atrocities at the hands of the police, hundreds of thousands of people have taken to the streets to protest and demand change. So I'll try to tackle some of those questions in turn. The first one, I think, was what kind of digital tools are out there being used by government? This is going to sound remarkably unsatisfying, but the reality is that right now we don't have a clear picture of who is monitored and how it protests, or even really by whom. History is recent history even, so really contemporary experiences provide some cautionary tales about government surveillance of activists and organizers. So there are some things we can imagine the government could turn to or may have already turned to. Certainly there are some ways in which protesters are being monitored right now by law enforcement that is very visible and maybe more obvious to the public. So aside from literally stationing police to watch protesters, some of the more obvious monitoring techniques include the use of body cameras, which were initially designed to be tools of public accountability, and drones, I think, are also a very obvious tool of surveillance. And I think we all observed with a great deal of alarm that CBP tasked a drone funded for its border enforcement responsibility. They tasked a drone over Minneapolis. And as has been mentioned by Alejandro and other speakers, there are numerous technologies available to law enforcement that they may deploy to identify who is at a protest, which protest, things like that. And those include technologies that capture some identifying information about your phone, like IMSI catchers, also known as cell site simulators. There are technologies that capture a timestamp of your vehicle and your license plate number, like automatic license plate readers, and has been a topic of frequent conversation. And it was just discussed, technologies that capture your face, like facial recognition technology. Additionally, increasingly, we're seeing law enforcement turn to social media to identify, to gather what they term situational awareness about what's happening and where. And I guess I'll say to that, folks should be mindful about what they post online and who they may be putting at risk, knowing that government could be looking at publicly available feeds. So it should go without saying, but the government shouldn't be monitoring and recording the activity of peaceful protesters. This kind of surveillance, as was just discussed, can chill participation. And we don't know how government might use the information they collect now about who's at a protest later. So amidst all this uncertainty about what governments what local police departments and federal agencies may be collecting, what they may be doing, what do we do about this glut of technology and data that's out there? And currently at the federal level in Congress, the House and Senate are going to be turning to criminal justice and policing measures, policing reform measures that have been pushed to the forefront of the conversation due to the amazing organizers and activists who are out on the streets protesting. And figuring out how to deal with surveillance technologies and surveillance reform, and coupling that with the amazing work going on in the criminal justice reform space is going to require following the lead of those very same people who are out on the streets and the organizers. And certainly we don't want to take away the space or the energy behind those movements. But I think there are some things we can do or recommend and advocate for to create a safe space for protesters who want to be out there without being subjected to unwarranted surveillance. So, in the space of what we can do, there's going to be measures you can take at your local level, and reforms at the local level, and then things that folks of us like us in DC are going to be thinking about. For protesters in the streets, with the exception of a few localities where federal agents have been deployed, their local police department will be the government that they likely have the most interaction with. And at the local level, we rarely have insight into what technologies are being purchased by a local police department, why, and what rules they have to abide by when they have those technologies, like how they're deployed, what data did they collect, things like that. We don't have transparency into that as a rule. But there's been a push for the last couple of years to get communities and cities to adopt ordinances that would change the presumption. So instead of law enforcement can secretly procure and use technologies, they'd have to be transparent about what they're seeking to get, how they plan to use it, things like that. And so these ordinances, as part of a campaign called Community Control Over Police Surveillance, would require the police to consult with city council and the public before they purchase the technology. They'd have to come up with a plan to mitigate and minimize the privacy and civil liberties, civil rights impacts of the use of the technology. And they'd have to get approval. So if the city council and the public aren't happy with the plan, the police don't get the technology. And in a really timely manner, ACLU, NorCal, and Oakland Privacy have put out a toolkit very recently that provides guidance to communities that are interested in getting one of these ordinances passed. So I said at the local level. At the federal level, there's a lot we can ask of Congress. Congress can play an important oversight role in investigating why federal agencies were tasked to support and potentially suppress protesters these last few weeks. A number have already sent oversight questions. They might also consider asking the inspector generals to investigate how the various departments, how and if they surveilled First Amendment protected activity, and also to investigate their history of engaging in such activity. Referring to some of the issues we've seen at the border, last year, it came to light that Customs and Border Protection had created dossiers of individuals who were reporting on, providing legal counsel to, or advocating on behalf of asylum seekers at the border. And the dossiers were leaked. And that in and of itself is an example of that agency surveilling, monitoring, making a record of First Amendment protected activity. So if the last few weeks haven't been cause enough, I think there's a history and a litany of examples of various federal agencies monitoring First Amendment protected activity that demands some investigation. In addition, as was just mentioned, the protests have reinvigorated the conversations about facial recognition technology, the threat they pose to First Amendment and Fourth Amendment rights. And thanks to the work of, again, the folks on the streets and organizers and activists like Joy Buolamwini, a number of companies have made public commitments not to sell facial recognition technology to police departments. And that's a remarkable step. The problem, though, is that the companies that have made that commitment are small in number. And there are a number of other vendors who currently do have contracts with law enforcement. So corporate action and restraint alone isn't going to be the answer here. We really need Congress to come forward and legislate in this space. We at CDT have been supporting the calls for a moratorium until we figure out if there's a framework that's sufficiently rights respecting and protecting for government to use facial recognition technology. I think I've just rambled on quite a bit there, so maybe I'll leave room for the other panelists.
Mana, it's always really interesting and a great time when you speak, so please feel free to ramble anytime you want. But I actually want to turn over to KJ. So KJ Bochy is the Senior Policy Counsel at New America's Open Technology Institute. And he works at the intersection of technology and policy to promote universal access to communication technologies that are both open and secure as a way of ensuring that every community has equitable access to digital technology and its benefits. So KJ has over 10 years of experience in public policy and legislative strategy at the local, state, and federal level. In addition to advising members of the Washington State Senate, he served as the legislative counsel for a DC council member and for a member of Congress who served for the influential House Appropriations Committee. So KJ, I'd love to kind of ask you to kind of share a little bit more about your work with OTI, and specifically if you could share with us what consumer privacy concerns arise within the context of our nationwide protests, and what kinds of policy prescriptions do you think we need in place to effectively mitigate the harms that all of us are vulnerable to online? And of specific importance, how do civil rights play into all of that?
Great. Well, thank you for the really simple question, Alejandro. Not packed at all, but I appreciate that. I think Mana did a great job of sort of queuing up like the other side of the coin, so to speak, of the privacy concerns that I think both our organizations work on. There's the government surveillance side and that interaction, and the other side is the consumer privacy. At least that's the way I've been looking at these issues. And, you know, I do have to step back and thank you and Ebony for bringing together this really important group of perspectives. It's great that you brought individuals from the sort of traditional tech policy organizations and also those organizations that are doing the work on the ground with communities, because I do think this is the type of dialogue we need to kind of move these issues forward. So, I mean, consumer privacy, I feel like we're all on the same page here, that we are living in a nation right now that has no consumer privacy protection. And so that means that any data that is collected on you, on your online activity, can be scraped and utilized in a way to bring harm, to deny you access to the sort of simple, you know, areas that we think of and when we think of basic rights. When we think about voting, think about employment, think about credit and housing. And these are all areas where that personal collection of data, that collection of personal data has been used to keep folks, mostly people of color, from having that access. And so when I think about the current moment right now, I think two thoughts kind of pop into mind. The first is when we're thinking about the protests and the folks on the ground who are taking pictures on their cell phone, who are going to social media platforms or other platforms, or are having their online activity influenced by the protests that are going on, that there is no protection currently from having that information scraped by any sort of company and potentially used by a government entity, by private companies. And we've seen this. I mean, I think the example that will probably give us all chills is that of Clearview AI, which, you know, works with law enforcement in collecting all publicly available photos. So they're not going to like protected accounts. They're using publicly available photos and using that to sort of identify individuals. And again, if we think about employers that may not want their employees, you know, taking part in these protests, if we think about any sort of entity in the future that may want to use some sort of technological tool to essentially discriminate against those folks who have been taking part in these protests, well, there's nothing stopping that from happening currently. And so again, like many of us on this, you know, panel have been talking about the need for comprehensive privacy legislation, obviously, as we think about the impact of government surveillance, but most importantly, I would argue, and that is the user action, right? Most of our, especially for people of color, who are now using technology to connect with families, to find music, to be connected to their culture, that online activity is now basically up for grabs. I think the second point, so of course there's a consumer privacy angle, thinking about the fact that our activity in real life, taking that online and how that is vulnerable to be used by, you know, third parties. The second sort of main, you know, issue I think we need to think about is that of the fact that, you know, Ebony referred to this in her opening remarks about the fact that we're living in a dual pandemic time. And so as state legislatures start thinking about what technological tools to use to attack COVID-19, it is really important to make sure that we have protections in place that ensure that any information collected in the, you know, combating of COVID-19 cannot be used by law enforcement, or, you know, must only be used for public health purposes. And so last, I think most folks on this panel joined a letter of, you know, we had 83 organizations that joined together to say, and we sent it to Congress, basically saying, look, if you're going to develop guardrails around COVID-19 technological tools that are, combating that disease, we need to make sure that civil rights issues, that civil rights are being protected there. That tool that's being developed cannot then be used to deny someone access to the voting ballot, deny someone access to housing and so on. And so the sort of the 2 points I see, again, the other issue is that a lot of localities, we've heard the term contact tracing. We've heard digital contact tracing, which essentially is, I'm probably butchering I'm probably, oversimplifying the definition of it, but basically being able to track individuals who have come into, into some sort of interaction with someone who was diagnosed with the virus. The other side of contact tracing is manual contact tracing, which is the old school, having public health officials call up the individual who was diagnosed and saying, hey, who did you interact with in the last 2 weeks? A lot of localities are using law enforcement to take part in this manual contact tracing. So I know that's not really part of the digital space that we're talking about, but I do think, again, in the moment we're living in, the fact that we're sort of in this dual pandemic, we have to connect it to the idea of how, COVID-19, the combating that disease can be used as a pretext for government or law enforcement entities collecting information to figure out, who was, maybe violating curfew, who maybe, got into some sort of altercation. And so we need to make sure that there are legislative, protections. Obviously, a lot of us focus on national issues, but that protection also has to start from the bottom up, from the local and the state communities as well.
Yeah, no, thanks, KJ. I think that, I really want to acknowledge that the conversation that we're having today really is broad and can be probably 10 different conversations, right, that we can dive directly into. I think we've definitely are addressing the issue of surveillance, facial recognition has come up, but the reality is that all of these pieces are interconnected. And, facial recognition becomes kind of dangerous or has a kind of exponential potential for harm because it can be connected to other pieces of information by government agencies and marketers. So, with the right tools, our data can easily be matched to our social media profiles, criminal histories, credit reports. We're seeing specifically within the Latino community and immigrant communities that, right now, if you want to apply for a visa or if you want to become a permanent resident, they're now like evaluating, right, all of your content on social media to make the determination if you're worthy of those types of visas or permissions to stay in the country, right? What we don't know is who is evaluating that and what criteria that they're using and how these determinations are being made. And I just think that to kind of both KJ's and Mana's points, we are seeing Congress really think about kind of sweeping police reform proposals that they'll restrict kind of body cameras or as a way of like surveilling First Amendment speech. But it sets out kind of specific rules about kind of like that video footage. But I think also what's dangerous, and Mana, you also talked about, the dossiers of people that are at the border, journalists that are documenting what's happening at the border. We've got like civil society that's there. We've got faith leaders that are there, like nuns are there, kind of providing aid and help. Right, all those dossiers, are being compiled on those people that haven't broken any laws. And I think, Mana, to your point, they not only were leaked, but they were actually distributed to other kind of law enforcement agencies across the country, right? And what we're seeing, in the response to the national protest is that we saw as the current administration call in the Department of Homeland Security, call in the Department of Justice, call in Customs and Border Enforcement, right? Immigration and Customs and Enforcement, and the Department of Defense, right? So now we're seeing a very kind of like intentionally collaborative police enforcement network that's out there surveilling people engaging in their constitutionally protected rights. So I actually want to kind of open that last question to KJ, to the rest of the panel. I just think, what are kind of like the policy prescriptions that we need to see, right, in order to mitigate the harms that all of us are kind of exposed to, right? And if KJ, I don't know if you want to kind of start us off, because, you know, HTTP and you and I have worked together both in your leadership capacity with the Asian American Pacific Islander Tech Table, and your role at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, specifically on the issue of consumer privacy protections. And you really have been key to kind of leading the charge in the civil rights community in regards to raising privacy concerns and digital privacy vulnerability specific to communities of color. So in your perspective or your experience working within the AAPI community, you know, why is digital privacy a specific concern to our communities of color?
Sure. I mean, I think the main issue is that there's no sort of cohesive way to explain to a lot of our communities that it's about having more control over data, right? Data is this invisible thing. It's not something you can trade. It's not something that you can physically trade. It's not something that that is tangible. And so the idea of having control over your own data, but also ensuring that those who are profiting off of our data actually have those restrictions in place and sort of create that that secondary protection, I think, is sort of the challenge, right? When trying to communicate these issues to other communities. I would also say that, and I'll obviously open it up to my fellow panelists, that a lot, and again, I kind of alluded to this earlier when I talked about the fact that this panel is made up of diverse perspectives, folks who are sort of deeply entrenched in the tech policy world, those who are focused on certain communities as it relates to tech policy, and those who are deeply engaged on the actual community organizing and empowering. And I do think that was, the reason that, in my former role that, we wanted to create this AAPI tech table. And that is to bring together this idea of tech policy and communities of color, because a lot of we have civil rights protections on the books for things that are happening in real life. And though there is some jurisprudence now that is sort of developing in how activities happen in the digital space, it's still not robust enough to think that these protections that we have that were fought for and are frankly still being fought for, and we see it now, they don't follow us to the digital space. And it's hard to communicate that and educate organizations that are focused on just the fight at hand. It's not that folks don't want to engage, it's just they're so busy trying to get their main mission out. And I also think the last challenge is a lot of communities of color are focused, on a specific issue area, right? They'll focus on housing, they'll focus on education policy. And so the idea of saying, look, we want you to do all that, but also let's now go to the technical space, digital space. Let's bring in the major platforms, and also let's bring in the platforms that no one's ever heard of and that are still collecting data on you and selling it to, other providers. I think that has been a challenge, but I think it's important to have more conversations like these that sort of connect, all parts of the conversation.
Yeah, I agree. If this were Instagram, I would double tap under KJ's last post, and in particular want to highlight the point he made about the weight and the responsibility that is often thrusted upon communities that are already carrying too much, right? Very in this moment, Ebony is acknowledging that my eyes are a little drowsy because I haven't been sleeping, and is talking about sending me a coffee maker so that I'm all right and able to function. Right. That is in part because while there's a lot that we don't know, and I echo the point that Carlos made, we do know that when it comes to our communities, both Black and queer community, acknowledging that those are often thought of as mutually exclusive, and they're not. What we do know about data and how data has been collected, particularly in this regard, is that it's been harmful for our communities. And so I want to highlight three things that I think are important for the record. One is that we know that there are companies that are actively using data and technology to profit from the victimization and further terrorism of Black bodies, right? It was just this year that Amazon agreed to not sell data to police departments for a year. Right. There could have been some amendments, but as I understand it, that was a term limited agreement that was enacted to stave off the kind of frustration that Amazon rightfully understands is going to come when more members of the community know that they are profiting from that kind of violence that will be incited by police departments being able to use that data to continue to act in ways that are very much connected to and anchored in our country's founding anchors in racism and anti-Blackness, right? Very much related to this, we often talk about data. There's a whole lot of data that we don't have around intersectional experiences. How COVID, for example, is affecting Black, queer, immigrants, who are not native to this country, or how COVID is affecting Black LGBTQ elders who might be in residential treatment facilities, doesn't exist because we don't have interoperable data sets that allow us to have these kinds of conversations. And that's important because there are things that we know anecdotally that COVID, for example, has affected Black people more than it has affected other communities. We are testing at higher rates, we are dying at higher rates, and most of us believe that the rates that have been reported are underreported, right? We also know anecdotally, if you are a member of the LGBTQIA plus community, again, because of how things are flattened, that tends to refer to white people, you are more inclined to have the kind of medical compromises that will increase the likelihood of you testing positive for COVID or otherwise dying from COVID-related complications. We don't have data that allows us to have conversations in the middle. And so we're now tripping over ourselves to use technology in ways that we already know have been leveraged by police departments to terrorize our communities. And we know that the only reason why they're doing it is for profit. And so I just want us all to be really clear about that as we're having conversations about solutions. A part of what we're doing is raising awareness so that people are risking their lives to protest, right? To register people to vote, to force people to think about voting and moving things in their quadrants with regard to police and sheriffs and DAs and others. This is a lot of the work we do in partnership with NAN. We are also trying to hold companies accountable for being better. There are so many companies, two of which I've named in the course of my remarks today, that are major players in this space. We all should be mindful of and hold them accountable for being good actors in this space as these conversations continue and the technology continues to evolve. We have to be clear that that's going to happen, right? And so I think that the opportunity for us is to hold people accountable for being good actors.
Yeah. No, thank you, David, for bringing that up. And I think you mentioned, a couple of things, and we actually had a viewer from Twitter submit a question specifically about this. But I mean, this week we did see, right, that IBM, Amazon, and Microsoft all suspended their supplier relationship with law enforcement for facial recognition, technologies, citing the lack of regulation and how that technology has been used. Although I think on the surface that's a good sentiment, what I heard was we are aware of the way that our technology is causing harm to Black and Brown communities, the way that it's currently being deployed, right? And so we want to ensure that they are specifically, and I think Microsoft CEO said, we want to wait until there is an adequate national law grounded in human rights to govern its use, right? And so I think for me, it's also kind of like, it's great to kind of pause, right? But also I think I saw that as a clear kind of admission that they are aware of the biases kind of baked into these technologies, right? And I think that they have a dangerous potential to kind of lump in minority communities into groups which kind of can falsely connect them to crimes that they didn't commit, right? I think that those are kind of like important things that we really kind of need to talk about and kind of bring into this conversation, because I think that without some kind of federal standard that requires transparency or limits on data sharing or retention, that really kind of applies to all of the players in the ecosystem, we're not really going to have that kind of that safety kind of like civil rights, consumer focused mindset, so that all of us can feel safe engaging with our phones, right? How many of us have phones or TVs or gadgets that we talk to, not knowing the amount of data that it's collecting on us and where that data kind of ends up. Carlos, I also want to kind of come back to you and see if you have any thoughts about anything that David or KJ kind of brought to light in this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I think that one of the things there's two things that came to light for me out of this conversation. One is kind of like the intersection between civil organizations and tech organizations. I think that a lot of the groups here are at that intersection, and I think it is incumbent upon us to kind of be the flag bearers of why technology is a civil rights issue. As we talk about facial recognition and a moratorium on it, it's not a technology issue, it is a civil rights issue. As we talk about encryption and why encryption is important for LGBTQ communities or journalists or domestic violence survivors around the country and around the world, that's a civil rights issue that is tech related. As we talk about, the ban and the moratorium, so we have a responsibility to explain and educate on why technology is a civil rights issue. But I think on the other side as well, I think we also are seeing how civil rights movements can impact technological decisions, and the facial recognition is an example of this. The Amazon one-year ban is obviously just a start, and certainly a place we need to have more conversations on, but the fact that IBM has kind of had an open-ended ban on facial recognition, and the fact that Amazon as well, Amazon, IBM, and I forgot the third one now. The three companies that did it this is a reaction to what's going on in the moment. So we should not forget that we have the ability to take the civil rights education and kind of the context that we have and bring them to technology to make some changes. So it is this circle, that keeps feeding on each other. The companies do something and we need to reinforce that message and educate, but we also need to push them on the civil rights side because we have the technological kind of ability to have those conversations in a way that connects both worlds. So I'm encouraged to see that there's some movement being done in this area that resulted out of the protest. There's still a lot of work to be done. And I think the group that's here is, at the forefront of making sure that those two kind of areas intersect.
Yeah, no, completely agreed. I think that it's important to really kind of tie it all together for people. And I think what I find really exciting about this moment is that all of us, everybody that is on this panel, everybody that's tuning in, everybody that's going to kind of access the conversation later on our website, we all have the ability to shape, a future in which, we all feel comfortable and protected, and technology is kind of working alongside us to help kind of solve pressing societal needs. And I think really it's up to us to kind of have a voice and kind of stand up and really kind of bring the issues that our communities experience to the forefront of that dialogue. And I actually kind of want to go back to Mana and KJ, because I think that we worked, last year on a set of kind of civil rights principles, and I'm happy to kind of link the one pager in the video description after the conversation, where we talked about, calling on Congress to protect consumers by passing a comprehensive national privacy law, right? And some of the kind of like fundamental kind of baseline civil rights protections that we kind of thought through as a part of that process was this idea of anti-discrimination and equal opportunity, right? Use limitations and consent frameworks, right? Algorithmic decision-making, right? What are our individual rights as consumers, right? And then I think right now, this moment has really kind of brought to our attention this idea of kind of like the constant eye of surveillance, right? So I wonder if KJ and Mana, you guys wouldn't mind kind of jumping in and see if you guys want to dig into kind of some of those like top line bullets that I just kind of threw out, because I know that you guys have both kind of spent quite a lot of time really digging into translating what that means to the everyday consumer.
KJ, maybe I'll defer to you since that's more of a consumer protection angle, but great principles.
Sure. I mean, yes. So yeah, I mean, I feel like you covered the principles pretty well, Alejandro. I mean, I do think that there's one point I want to sort of make in the closing minutes, and maybe Mana can sort of add on to this. I think a lot of our conversations around privacy protection focuses on what we want the companies to do or covered entities to do. And I think that's fair, right? Because the only person, if you don't have legislation, then you're just relying on the whim of goodwill from these companies. And in the moment, we see, we see IBM, Microsoft, Amazon reacting to it. So, and that's great for now. And, it seems term limited. It seems like it's in the moment. But I do think that we as users also, consumers also have to sort of think about how we are interacting in the digital space. And sort of, I'll just make this my kind of closing remarks, or like as a public service announcement. A lot of folks are putting their bodies on the line. They are, being attacked by law enforcement, being attacked by, white supremacists under the guise of being a part of these protests. And as Mana referenced, we don't know what technological tools are being used for surveillance. And so when people take that picture and put it up on Instagram, and, I have a lot of friends who take beautiful photography, and they use this moment to capture these historic moments, but they're taking pictures that are capturing the faces of individuals who may not have given their consent, who may be a part of the moment, but are not trying to necessarily align themselves with what is going on. And so, and frankly, you're creating vulnerability that doesn't need to be made just because you want that, that great post. And so I would just say, again, it is important for comprehensive privacy legislation. It's important to have the civil rights protections, and we should definitely do that. But we as consumers and users also have to be mindful about the moment we're in, and the fact that something may look glamorous in a moment, but there are literally people who are putting their lives on the line just to be, to continue these protests. And so, yeah, and I mean, defer to Mana on sort of the government implications of things that we still don't know what could be used against us.
Thanks, KJ. I also just want to +1 everything that I've heard from KJ, David, Carlos, Alejandro, yourself. I think this is a really great discussion, and the intersection of the tech groups and the civil rights groups, it's been going on for years. I think it's only becoming more important. To build off of what KJ said, there's obviously this like strong interlink between consumer privacy and government surveillance, because if companies don't collect data, if they don't sell it, if they don't launder it, it doesn't end up in the hands of government because there won't be anything for government to get. So things like use limitations, the other principles that you mentioned can help constrain and limit the gorge of data that is out there about each of us that can be really hard to control for. Some things that government could do in response to the moves made by corporate actors this last week, as I mentioned, is like respond to what the companies have done and issue a moratorium, because the three companies, IBM, Amazon, and Microsoft, are not the end all be all of the market for that technology. And when I think about like the incredible work that David, KJ, Carlos, you all are doing to hold companies accountable, I think we are in this moment where companies are facing this reckoning of understanding that they are enabling surveillance and harm to Black and brown communities, and that government is not keeping up with what they're doing, with their innovations, with what they're enabling local police, federal agencies to do. So I think it does behoove companies to be very thoughtful and to engage with communities and to understand the implications of the products that they're putting out there, who they're selling to, do your due diligence. Are you selling to an entity that can be trusted to protect the human rights of the people who may be on the other end of the tool? So I guess I'll end with that, and also plea that for Congress to legislate in this space so that we have more strict known rules about when we can use certain technologies and when we can't.
Thank you for that. Ebony, any final thoughts?
I really enjoyed the conversation. As someone who protested in Baltimore myself during Freddie Gray, I know I was definitely a victim of government surveillance there. You can physically hear, you can hear the drones flying around, especially during that time. I am, very concerned about making sure our young people are protected while they're out there. And David made a really great point about the takeaways. And we heard KJ speak to being mindful of the post, and Mana also touched on that. Are there any, I just had one last question, it's a quick one. Are there any tips that we can give to our young people? Again, something real quick that they can keep in mind as they do this work in protesting. And then I also heard about the legislative piece. So if we can share information around actions around legislation on the federal level and state level after the panel, that'll be great.
I've got 3 for young people. The first is we tell them that they don't need their phones when protesting. If they have a phone, there should be someone in the group designated to use Signal to communicate to people, right? And so this is really about whereabouts, updates, receiving information about strategy, where people are meeting, and to have designated times where people are expected to check in. If young people or adults are protesting and you see people recording, taking still images or video, ask them to stop. There's not a reason for people to be recording while people are protesting in that regard. And often if they are, they're working for, or they're either cops or they're working for or with the cops, right? And so the first is to be mindful of that and to train them on the usage of cell phones while they're protesting. The second thing, to my earlier point about mental health, and I posted this on my Instagram, there was an interview of a 17-year-old Black girl who was talking to Ali Velshi in New York, after having witnessed her classmate having been beaten by a police officer. And Ali Velshi asks her if she's concerned about her physical safety and well-being, because they're at the point where they're having this conversation after they're about to violate curfew. And this young girl, this child, the 17-year-old says, I'm willing to risk it all. And she communicates being willing to go to jail and risk being exposed to COVID or being willing to die. We also have to be mindful of the mental health implications of all that we're talking about, right? There are so many connections between the use of technology and increases in suicidal ideation, attempts, and completion. And we could go on. That probably is another panel in and of itself. But the point I want to make here is that we also have to be mindful of the mental health and well-being of protesters, in particular of our babies as they protest, to respond to the point that Ebony made. The last thing is that we, NBJC, is drafting a policy report anchored in what the Black queer community needs in order to thrive, acknowledging the most recent pandemic that we are all experiencing, particularly as it relates to COVID, the related crises around our economy and economic constraints, and the mental health crisis that I mentioned are also noteworthy in that regard. And so I encourage anyone who's listening, again, understanding the importance of data and the challenges I mentioned, because data sets are designed to not allow us to have complicated, complex conversations about race, is to take the COVID While Black and Queer survey that we are operating. It's at bit.ly/COVID While Black and Queer. You do not have to be queer in order to complete the survey, but you do have to have connections to the diaspora and be Black in some way. You can be Afro Caribbean, Afro Latinx, again, their intersection. So I encourage you all to take that survey, as we will be using some of the stories that are communicated and the policies that were shared, including by Carlos, KJ, and Mazi on this, so that we can include that in our policy report. So really thankful for all of everyone's collective efforts. We'll continue to show up and be a good partner in this work.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all again for a great conversation today. To everybody joining us from home, please make sure to follow the work of our panelists at CDT, LGBT Tech, OTI, NAN, the National Black Justice Coalition. I'll make sure to put their information in the video description below. And please also make sure to follow HTTP on our social channels. That's just at HTTP Policy, to be the first to hear about our upcoming conversations presented as a part of our Connected Communities digital briefing series. So until then, speak up, speak out, and stay connected, and take care of each other. Thank you, guys. Have a good day.